Speaker. Well, the rumors that the Liberals would push through the legislation on the new NAFTA after Mike Pence's visit are now a reality. Since 2015, we've heard this government talk about their so-called progressive trade agenda time and again. The question that Canadians should be asking about the new NAFTA is why, if the Liberals are truly interested in improving the deal, why are they undermining the efforts right now in the U.S. to improve it? Right now, Congress and Labour in the U.S. are working hard to improve the key progressive elements in this agreement. In 4 separate letters sent to Ambassador Lighthizer, they have laid out their call for stronger language to improve labour and environmental provisions. They are also pushing hard to change the intellectual property protections in the new NAFTA that favor big pharma and will lock in high prescription drug costs for all 3 countries. No progressive party should be arguing to increase the cost of medication for citizens, and on this basis alone, we should support their efforts. And I have to note, Mr. Speaker, it was quite interesting to have the minister in the House earlier giving her speech and not even mention that the cost of drugs will be going up for Canadians. Certainly I can understand why she wouldn't want to wear that badge proudly, but it's something that the Liberals need to be honest with Canadians about. They are now increasing the cost of medication on a whole host of biologics that many, many Canadians rely on for their health, and that just is fundamentally wrong. This renegotiation is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to right the wrongs of the original NAFTA, which have cost Canadians hundreds of thousands of jobs. New Democrats believe that truly progressive trade means working with our partners to improve the lives of Canadians. Instead, it appears that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs are choosing to ram through this legislation at the end of Parliament to bow to President Trump. It would be no surprise that Trump wants the new NAFTA signed to put pressure on the Democrats in Congress to back down from their progressive asks. But the real surprise here in Canada is that the self-proclaimed progressive government that claims to value the environment, fair working conditions, affordable medication, is now bowing to U.S. pressure. And Mr. Speaker, that's not something that Canadians are proud of, to see our government not trying to get improvements that would help the lives of Canadians. So we all know that the U.S. is our largest trading partner. I come from a region in southwestern Ontario. I'm right on the border of the U.S. We have the largest border crossing on the bridge there, the Ambassador Bridge, soon to be the new Gordie Howe Bridge. We have a tunnel crossing, we have a rail crossing, we have a ferry crossing. We are crossing in every way possible, and goods flow across that border every single day at a very, very high volume. So certainly we understand the importance of trade in our region. But we also have a responsibility to ensure that trade deals are being negotiated in the best interest of Canadians. And Mr. Speaker, there is no reason to rush this ratification in Canada. And I have to say, the minister earlier also said that we're moving in tandem with our partners. That's false. The U.S. hasn't even tabled legislation on the floor of Congress yet, and has said, Speaker Pelosi herself has said they will not do until they can come to some sort of an agreement with Ambassador Lighthizer. So to say somehow that we're moving in tandem is completely and utterly false. The U.S. is not moving at all in that process. Of course, they're in part of their TPA process right now. That's true. But to say that they're moving towards ratification is not the case. So the Liberal government could and should join New Democrats in our support of what's happening in Congress and their important efforts. If there is any attempt to improve this deal to protect jobs, workers, the environment, and the cost of medication, why would the Liberal government not be supportive of that? That really is bizarre to me, Mr. Speaker. Conservatives under Brian Mulroney, of course, were the original architects of NAFTA. And at the time, they ignored the alarm bells that were being raised about job losses and impacts. And the member for London Fanshawe sat provincially at that time, Mr. Speaker, and she told me at the time, everything that they raised, all of the issues that they brought forward prior to the signing is exactly what's come to pass in these 25 years. The incredible amount of job losses, the textile industry being completely eradicated in our country. The vintners, our wine sector, lost 50%. 50%, Mr. Speaker. So we've had widespread, job loss throughout our country, and for some reason, there seems to not want to be an acknowledgement of that in this House. So the Liberals should not be so quick to make the same mistake. they should listen, and any attempt to improve labor provisions in particular should be supported and championed. The NDP has repeatedly raised major concerns about the impact this deal will have on Canadians. The new NAFTA has sacrificed our dairy farms, locks in the increased cost of medication for sick and vulnerable people, and provides no guarantee that workers' jobs will be protected. Our number one priority is protecting Canadian jobs. If the Liberals rush this new NAFTA through, they'll be sending a signal to working people in Canada that they are more interested in a trophy on their trade shelf than they are in improving the lives of working people who are deeply impacted by trade. At the heart of NAFTA are millions of people who work every day for a decent life for their families and their communities. I'm one of these people. Before I was elected, I was an auto worker from Ontario. I lost my job, Mr. Speaker. I was laid off for 3 years because investments were going only one way after the signing of NAFTA, heading right down to the south, chasing cheaper wages. 23 years ago, when NAFTA was being originally negotiated by those Mulroney Conservatives, they tried desperately to sell Canadian workers on the idea that it's more than just a trade deal. They tried to make the case that this trilateral deal would bring prosperity to everyone across the continent. They claimed it was going to be an equalizer for all. You know, there's an analogy that they use that really gets to me, Mr. Speaker, and they say that NAFTA was a high tide that would float all boats. Well, the only boats that anyone saw raised were yachts, and many of the other boats just sunk. Working people studied NAFTA carefully at the time, and they began to raise those alarm bells that it wouldn't work. Labor and civil society brought their concerns to the streets over the weak side agreements, and they rightly claimed that it would do nothing to change the inequalities if they didn't improve the deal then. Conservatives pressed on, and now in 2018 we see the impact, or 2019, the impact this deal has had in every community across our country. Successive governments have neglected to address the alarming reality that the NAFTA promise of 1994, has not led to an increased standard of living for all. The only benefit has been for those who already hold the power and influence. And where are we at today? Well, income inequality and wealth inequality in Canada is at a crisis level. 46% of Canadians are $200 away from financial trouble. And to say that NAFTA hasn't played a role in that economic instability is just complete nonsense. As I said, I was an auto worker from southwestern Ontario, and I saw the effects of NAFTA every day. When I started working 23 years ago at Ford Motor Company, we had 6 plants in Windsor, Ontario, 6,700 people working. Today we have 2 plants and 1,500 people. And there is a direct line to be tied between those job losses and NAFTA. Every contract negotiation after NAFTA was signed, we were reminded that our jobs could go to Mexico in a heartbeat. That was always the threat. And it's been held over the heads of working people in the Canadian manufacturing sector at every contract table since NAFTA was signed. And Mr. Speaker, we just saw this down at CAMI at Local 88 Unifor in Ingersoll last year, where they were out on the line on strike because they were being threatened to have their jobs moved to Mexico. Not surprisingly, there wasn't a Liberal to show up on that line, Mr. Speaker, because those people were living the reality of NAFTA and what has happened to working people. And I'm not saying that working people in Mexico and the U.S. have it any better. In Mexico, people are constantly threatened to accept unsafe working conditions and keep their wages low. They're threatened that if they ask for more or better, they won't be able to attract that work away from Canada and the U.S. Labor conditions in Mexico in practice do not reflect their international standards or commitments, and the regulations are not enforced. The minimum earned salary in Mexico is $142 Canadian per month. But even that is not meeting the monthly minimum living wage in Mexico of $177 Canadian. Now, Mr. Speaker, how can workers in Canada compete with extremely low, unfair wages to workers who are being treated poorly? It's shameful that Canadian companies and global companies are down in Mexico taking advantage of the Mexican workers. And what we have in the new NAFTA, there is a $16 average wage, but many across the labor movement are concerned that when you look at an average wage, you look at the entire plant. So you're looking at the executives, the management, and the wages of the Mexican workers won't go up at all. Because quite frankly, that's what the minimum wage or the average wage is going to be. And that's if corporations even try or pretend to try to achieve this at all, because quite frankly, the tariff's so low, there's no incentive for them to even follow through with this. So whether or not this will work, this is a gamble we're taking on the backs of working people once again when we've lost hundreds of thousands of jobs. And we have this transnational blackmail that's happening between our countries, and it has hurt all working people. And this is because we are all connected, and working people are always looking to raise standards for others. So then there's the disappearance of a chapter to promote gender equality. When the deal was signed, it included provisions for improving conditions for working women that included workplace harassment, pay equity, equality issues, but for some reason, these didn't survive the scrub phase and have completely disappeared. So what do Liberals have to say about this loss? Where did this promised gender chapter go? Although I have to be honest, Mr. Speaker, as New Democrats, we don't believe that a chapter is sufficient, and it's not the answer. We need a full gender analysis and a gender impact assessment on this deal and every trade deal that we sign. But we've yet to see one from this Liberal government or any indication that this is a direction they're going in. So certainly women have been, once again, knocked completely off the table in this deal without any explanation from the minister today, certainly, about why that happened. The minister today did talk about Indigenous people, though, and I will say there was a promise of a chapter to promote Indigenous rights. It doesn't exist in the CUSMA either. So once again, Liberals are signing another trade agreement that disrespects Article 19 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which states that they have to obtain free, prior, and informed consent. So Indigenous peoples, again, New Democrats believe shouldn't be just delegated to a chapter. They should be at the negotiating table and considered a full partner in any trade deal. We certainly heard the minister reference a lot of the provincial partners that she worked with, but we didn't hear her talk about the Indigenous partners that she worked with at that table because they simply weren't at the table in an equal fashion. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think we've talked about this a bit throughout the day about what's happening in the states. But this is why Congress is working hard to improve this deal. And I mentioned that I met with Nancy Pelosi last week and several other Democrats, and I told her that New Democrats in Canada support the efforts and the important work that Congress and Labour are trying to push for in the States. It's quite incomprehensible why Liberals, who actually came out after we forced them to at the Trade Committee with some of their objectives, have let those things completely fall off the table, Mr. Speaker. So we have an opportunity to truly fix this deal, fix the problems, but it appears that Liberals don't want to be a part of that, and they can't seem to answer why. Why are we putting this pressure to not get these improvements and doing Donald Trump's dirty work? Like, quite frankly, it's mind-boggling. And this whole idea of Pandora's box, that somehow we're going to open Pandora's box and we all have to be afraid of that, that's way too scary. We can't actually approve the deal because we're afraid of what they might do, is complete nonsense. This is happening in the States. They are pushing for this, and there's actually precedent of this happening before. In 2007, there were 4 trade agreements that were opened at the same time in a very targeted fashion, and they were able to achieve improvements. So why would we not support that? And why are the Liberals fear-mongering to the Canadian public, trying to make them think that better is not possible? So I want to talk about dairy and supply management. And many people know that in the new NAFTA, Canada is once again throwing our dairy families under the bus to appease the U.S. And the U.S. will gain 3.59% access to our dairy market. So on top of the concessions that were in CPTPP and CETA, that brings the total loss to 10% market share. Now I have to ask, Mr. Speaker, what other group or sector would Liberals and Conservatives dare cut 10% of their market share from? That's mind-boggling. But for some reason, they've become the favorite to just throw completely under the bus. But that's not even the worst of it for our dairy farmers, who, by the way, aren't the wealthy people that some in this House would have you believe. These are hardworking families in my community, in Essex certainly, and across the country. People like Mark Stannard and Vicki Morrison. I've been to their farms and I know how much pride they put into producing top quality milk for our communities. So we all know that bovine growth hormone is used by American dairy farmers, and milk production, it increases the milk production. And by the way, that BGH is created by Monsanto. And we have absolutely no studies on the effect of human health of this hormone that's being used. And the people that I know, who we live in a border city, would much rather see that little blue cow and know that it's Canadian milk than wonder where it's coming from and what's in it. And they would rather pay the prices, which are actually, honestly, we're right in line with the rest of the globe on the prices that we pay, to know that we're getting quality milk that's safe for our families. The other thing that they did in the CUSMA is that they have this provision that grants the U.S. oversight into the administration of the Canadian dairy system. So while Liberals like to say that they protected it and they're not dismantling it, now they have to go to the U.S. to get permission to do anything in our own system. This is an issue of sovereignty, and the farmers are rightly raising it and asking why the Liberals have done this. You know, we were forced to abandon our Class 7 milk pricing, and also it allows the U.S. to limit and monitor our exports, not just to the U.S., but to the world. Mr. Speaker, we've given up far more than just the percentage of market share when it comes to our dairy farmers, and our dairy farmers are certainly not happy about the situation we're in. I want to talk about the cost of medication and also what, again, a major concession in this deal that the minister did not even address earlier and fails to do so at every turn. You know, we pay the second highest prices in the Western world, and the IP provisions that Liberals have agreed to appease Big Pharma in this deal will increase the cost of drugs for 2 more years. We've extended the patent, and these are biosimilar drugs like insulin, drugs that treat Crohn's, like the brand Humira, rheumatoid arthritis. But thanks to the parliamentary budget officer, my colleague the member from Vancouver Kingsway, initiated a study. We know that the estimated drug cost of the CUSMA in the first year alone are $169 million. We are literally making medication more expensive at a time when our country is demanding a national pharmacare program because people can't afford their medication. You know, if we didn't know that Liberals are doing the work of Big Pharma in the fact that they have not introduced a national pharmacare in 4 years and keep dangling that carrot out in front of Canadians, we certainly know that they did it in the New Deal, and they don't even want to talk about it or the reality of it. This is one of the areas that the U.S. Congress is trying to fix. And again, it's people and patients in all 3 countries that are going to pay the price for these, pay the price, and then the profits are going to continue to soar for Big Pharma. And I know there are people who say, well, we need that patent extension so there can be more R&D in our country. Well, Mr. Speaker, we're below 4% R&D. There's no R&D investment that's happening in Canada. And Big Pharma's made this promise to us before when they got an extension on their patent, and they didn't follow through on that deal. So why do we keep rewarding them for bad behavior that's costing Canadians, and Canadians aren't even able to take their drugs that they need? Copyright. The copyright in Chapter 20, the provisions raised from the term from life plus 50 to life plus 70. This is another TPP hangover that exists that, again, the Liberals have happily signed on to in here. And this will raise educational costs alone by millions of dollars. In fact, when we did the study on the TPP, we had Girl Guides and librarians coming to warn us about this provision and how it would not only cost us money, but it would limit accessibility to these works in our public space. If we look at pardon me, Mr. Speaker. If we look at all of these things, where you work, what you eat, the drugs that you need, these are all things that matter to Canadians. And these are all concessions that Liberals have given up in this deal. Mr. Speaker, New Democrats will always stand for fair trade that benefits the lives of Canadians, and the new NAFTA is simply not good enough for Canadians in its current form, and we are strongly united to see the changes and the work that's being done in the U.S. to go through, and we hope that the Liberals will stop this foolishness of ramming this through the House because there is nothing happening in the States right now until this deal happens. And join us to see a truly progressive deal for working people, for Canadians. And to be honest, working people should not be expected to pay the price for bad negotiations. And if the Liberals force this legislation through, they are throwing away our greatest opportunity to make trade fairer for Canadians.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was an interesting speech, and I think at this time where there's so much exaggeration, that we need to be very careful on how we present the facts. And there's an onus on all of us to ensure what we say has a sense of truth and validity, which we can back it up. And I want to ask the member how it is she could say that Indigenous people or have been somehow shortchanged or relegated to the back seat on this agreement. I just want to take a minute to quote the National Chief, Perry Bellegarde, from the Assembly of First Nations, Mr. Speaker, who said the provisions addressing Indigenous people in the USMCA make it the most inclusive international trade agreement for Indigenous peoples to date. The protection for Indigenous peoples' rights in the general exceptions to the agreement will protect inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights, as well as increase stability, certainty, and integrity to international trade. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the member to explain why she put perhaps confusing statements on the record when the truth is Indigenous people are proud of a Liberal government making a better international agreement.
The Honourable Member for Essex.
Well, I suppose, Mr. Speaker, when there's a low bar for involving Indigenous people, then I understand why the Liberals believe that they've gotten over that bar. But we are actually signatories to Article 19 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And in there, it says that you must obtain free, prior, and informed consent. And so if I could ask a question back, what I would ask is why the Liberals didn't achieve that and have yet to achieve that in any single trade deal that exists. That is not respecting Indigenous people, and I understand that they think that having a few things in this agreement is better than what they've previously had, which is quite a sad statement, Mr. Speaker, because Indigenous people should be full partners at the table, not relegated to a few lines in a trade agreement.
Honourable Member for Niagara West.
And I want to thank my colleague for her intervention. I do take exception with some of her comments on wine. We're going to have to talk about that later. I think NAFTA caused the Canadian industry to step up their game in a big way, and with help of the government to pull out some of the stuff they called wine before and actually plant some newer vinifers. Anyways, my question to the member is, I asked the minister in terms of ratification process and timing. I agree with the member in terms of the confusion or the lack of direction in the U.S. around ratification as it relates to the Democrats and to Mr. Trump. And so my question is, I asked the question about ratification, whether it's something going to happen now or later. My thoughts are that they should hold off until the U.S. is actually in a position to move forward so we don't play all our cards and box ourselves into a position. So my question would be, do you believe that the Liberals are looking at ratifying as a way to show in the window for the next election, look at us, we've ratified, even though that's disingenuous given the fact that we have so much uncertainty in the U.S. right now?
Member for Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I will say to my colleague about the vintners that the Canadian vintners have a great presentation on the impact of NAFTA. I can't say it's great because it actually shows that we lost 50% market share. So I invite him to contact them to get that information. But I will say that as far as this ratification and rushing this through, I certainly agree with them. I think I said in my speech, I believe that they're trying to put a trophy on the trade shelf. Their record on trade is quite abysmal, to be honest. You mentioned softwood lumber agreement, I believe in your particular speech. We still have no resolution on that. The steel and aluminum tariffs are not gone. there are still provisions for them to be returned. We have auto tariffs, a 232 decision that has a 6-month extension. There are still numerous threats that exist, and our trading relationship with the U.S. is quite precarious at the moment, and to say otherwise is disingenuous. But when it comes to the ratification process and why we're rushing this through, I actually, in my speech, mentioned that I believe that they're doing the work of Donald Trump. That Donald Trump wants to stop the work that's happening in Congress. We all see what's happening in that relationship in the United States right now, and that the Liberals apparently have decided, after potentially a visit of Vice President Pence, that they're going to help him do that work. They're not interested in the progressive change.
Questions and comments. Come on to the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my honourable friend from Essex, I certainly share many of her concerns about this new version, either NAFTA 2.0, COSMA, or USMCA, depending where you stand and what country you're in. I have concerns, and I'm also torn. This bill, the NAFTA 2.0 COSMA, certainly is a vast improvement in finally getting rid of the investor state provisions in Chapter 11. It's certainly an improvement to get rid of the energy proportionality, and that clause really tied Canada's hands on energy security. It's lamentable to see it chip away at supply management, as she's pointed out, and it's certainly worrying that it does more to protect Big Pharma in patent protection. So in figuring out where we go with this as a parliament, how do we discount the importance of getting rid of U.S.-based corporations having the right to sue Canada, because invariably they win and we lose?
Well, member for Essex.
Well, I thank the member for her comments, and I'd like to say that the IP provisions on their own are quite extensive. And I think I mentioned the copyright. I didn't mention sovereignty, I believe, but we can talk about sovereignty and the fact that now we need permission from the states, not just on trade agreements, but on regulatory issues. So while Chapter 11 is a long, hard fight, New Democrats have been part of that fight, Labour, civil society. It's interesting to me that Liberals are now on board with that when we know that it was a U.S. ask, but also that they still argue for it in the CETA, they argue for it in the CPTPP and other trade agreements they seem to think it's okay in, but in this one, because the U.S. wanted it removed. I really credit all the people on the ground for the work that they did to see that removed, but there are many ways that the U.S. in a regulatory way can still come into our space and try to determine what we do and what we regulate. So the fact or the idea that we've somehow eliminated that corporate pressure on us is not entirely true. And so we really still need to be vigilant about other countries and corporations being able to dictate to us what we can let.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Hamilton Mountain.
Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague member from Essex for all her great work that she's done on this file.
Hear, hear.
It's totally been amazing, the passion that she has for this and making sure we get this right. So I want to say thank you. One of the issues and the concerns that we have in Hamilton and also across the country and the provinces that when we have the steel industry and the manufacturing industry was when the problem with tariffs. Now, we're very, very happy that when we heard the announcement the tariffs were lifted, but I want to ask her, do we know if all the details of that agreement? And the reason why I ask that is because one of the problems and concerns the steel industry had was about quotas. And I understand there's no quotas mentioned in the new document, which is very good, but the new word has come and invented called surge. What does that mean? Does that mean that tariffs can come back on at any time if some of this word surge, if it's surpassed? Or are the tariffs definitely gone away? Thank you.
The honourable member for Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think my colleague, he's done incredible work on the steel file as well. We sit on the Steel Caucus together, and it really has been a team effort, certainly working with Labour and across all of the stakeholders to see the removal. But like he points out, in the agreement that we have, the tariffs aren't actually gone. They still could be imposed at any time, and the surge is completely undefined. Completely. So I know some of my conservative colleagues talk about certainty and the importance of that, and businesses being able to know, what they can expect. And when we have undefined terms, and I have asked the minister directly this question in QP, and I haven't received an answer from her because I don't believe there's an interpretation or a joint understanding of what surge means. So there are loopholes that you could drive a truck through in removing these tariffs, and there is a lot of uncertainty and fear on the ground that those tariffs could come back. And the other piece that we gave up, everyone knows that we didn't just reciprocate on the tariffs, but we had that secondary list trying to impose some pressure. We've given up that ability. So we can reciprocate, but we can't have any further tariffs on the U.S. So we actually have given up quite a bit in achieving the loss of these, and there is no certainty for people who work across the steel sector or steel producers or steel manufacturers like Atlas Tube in my riding.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Sydney Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I begin, I'd like to inform you that I'll be splitting my time with the member from New Brunswick South.